I was the waitress who served his deaf mother with care, and the millionaire couldn't hold back tears. But what you won't see is the broken woman behind the smile, swallowed by years of silent battles. No one hears the sound of my own heart cracking beneath the apron. Maybe you're serving tables for people who don't appreciate it, or cleaning up after everyone else has left. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Evelyn Martinez, and I've been carrying trays longer than some people have been breathing. 57 years old, hands that shake from years of balancing plates, feet that scream every morning when I lace up these worn-out shoes. The smell of burnt coffee and grease has soaked into my uniform so deep that sometimes I wonder if it's become part of my skin. This is Manhattan, the city that never sleeps, they say, but honey, I barely sleep either. Every morning at 4:30, my alarm cuts through the darkness like a knife. The subway ride from Queens to the Upper East Side takes 45 minutes on a good day, longer when there's delays, which is always. I press my face against the cold window and watch the city wake up while my body begs to stay in bed. The restaurant where I worked, is called Le Jardin. Fancy French name for a place that treats its staff like furniture. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths that cost more than my monthly Metro card, and customers who wear watches worth more than my yearly rent. I learned to make myself invisible there. Smile, nod, take the order, bring the food, collect the tip if you're lucky. Disappear until they need you again. For 12 years, I walked those marble floors. 12 years of, "Excuse me, waitress," and snapped fingers and complaints about water spots on glasses. 12 years of watching wealthy families celebrate birthdays while I missed my own daughter's graduation because I couldn't afford to take the night off. The irony wasn't lost on me, serving other people's happiness while my own life grew colder with each passing season. My manager, Richard, was a thin man with beady eyes who treated the waitstaff like we were personally responsible for every bad review on Yelp. He had this way of looking through you, like you weren't quite human enough to deserve his full attention. The kitchen staff called him El Diablo behind his back, but never loud enough for him to hear. We all needed our jobs too much to risk his wrath. The other waitresses became my family, in a way. Maria, who immigrated from El Salvador and sent money home to 3 kids she hadn't seen in 4 years. Sandra, a former actress in her 60s, who still believed her big break was coming. And Carmen, barely 22, working double shifts to pay for nursing school. We protected each other the way women do when the world tries to grind us down. A warning look when a customer got too handsy, a shared tip when someone's section was slow, small acts of kindness that kept us human in a place that wanted us to be machines. But kindness doesn't pay the bills. My apartment in Astoria is a 1-bedroom with thin walls and thinner patience from my landlord. Rent went up again this year. The subway fare increased, groceries cost more. My tips stayed the same if I was lucky. Some nights I'd sit at my kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that would never fit together properly. My daughter Lisa lives in Chicago now. She's a lawyer, successful, everything I dreamed she'd become. But success has a price, and that price was distance. Our phone calls grew shorter over the years. "I'm so busy, Mom. Can we talk later? Things are crazy at work." I understood. I really did, but understanding doesn't fill the empty spaces where a mother's heart expects to find her children. My son Michael is closer, physically at least. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 kids I barely see. Occasional Sunday dinners where I feel like a guest in my own grandchildren's lives. They're good kids, but I'm just abuela who works at the restaurant, not the woman who sang them lullabies or the person who has stories worth hearing. Just the grandmother who comes bearing takeout containers and tired smiles. The loneliness is the hardest part, not the aching feet or the rude customers or even the bills that pile up faster than I can pay them. It's coming home to silence. It's eating dinner alone while watching other people's lives play out on television. It's lying in bed at night and wondering if anyone would notice if I didn't show up tomorrow. But I showed up anyway. Every single day for 12 years, I showed up. Because that's what you do when you're a woman like me. You endure. You survive. You find small moments of beauty in a world that rarely offers them. Like the way morning light filters through the restaurant windows before we open, or the grateful smile from an elderly customer who remembers what it means to say thank you, or the sound of Maria humming while she sets up her tables, a song from her homeland that carries both sadness and hope in its melody. I learned sign language 15 years ago when my niece was born deaf, my sister's baby, perfect in every way except for the silence that surrounded her. I studied at night after work, practicing finger positions until my hands cramped. I wanted to be the aunt who could communicate, who could bridge the gap between my niece's world and ours. It became a skill I treasured, this ability to speak without words, to connect with people who lived in a different kind of quiet than the rest of us. That skill would change everything. Though I didn't know it at the time. The night he walked in, the restaurant hummed with its usual tension. Rich diners complaining about perfectly cooked steaks, wine that cost more than my weekly paycheck, conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. I was refilling water glasses with mechanical precision when the door chimed, and in walked a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Andrew Belmont. Even if you don't follow business news, you've heard the name. Real estate developer, venture capitalist, one of those Manhattan millionaires whose wealth seemed to grow by the hour through investments in everything from cryptocurrency to luxury hotels. His portfolio was worth hundreds of millions. His penthouse overlooked Central Park, and his reputation for ruthless business dealings preceded him like a shadow. The man turned distressed properties into gold mines, made fortunes trading Bitcoin when others were afraid to take the risk, and collected assets the way some people collect stamps. But wealth doesn't make you kind. Money doesn't teach you how to treat the people who serve your dinner. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my car if I still had one. His watch caught the light, a Rolex that gleamed like a small sun on his wrist. Everything about him screamed success, from his perfectly styled hair to his confident stride across our dining room. The hostess practically genuflected as she led him to his table, the best one in the house, naturally. With him was an elderly woman who moved with careful, measured steps. His mother, I learned later. She was elegant in a way that spoke of old money, family wealth that predated Andrew's modern fortune. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, her powder blue dress classic and expensive. But there was something gentle about her that her son lacked entirely, something vulnerable in the way she looked around the restaurant, like she was trying to read lips from across the room. Richard assigned me to their table. "Be extra careful with this one, Evelyn," he warned in his scratchy whisper. "Mr. Belmont's a regular, big tipper when he's happy, nightmare when he's not." I approached their table with the same professional smile I'd perfected over 12 years. "Good evening. Welcome to Le Jardin. Can I start you with something to drink?" Andrew barely looked at me. "Bottle of the Chateau Margaux, the 2005. He rattled off a wine that cost $800 without blinking. Money was clearly no object when you had millions in assets generating passive income through dividends and interest every month. His mother turned toward me, and I saw the hearing aid tucked discreetly behind her ear. She was studying my lips with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to read the world through sight instead of sound. Something clicked in my brain. A recognition, maybe. The careful way she held her head, the slight delay before responding. I'd seen this before with my niece. When she struggled to understand my spoken greeting, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I raised my hands and signed slowly, clearly. "Good evening. What would you like to drink?" Her face transformed. The polite confusion melted into genuine surprise, then joy. She signed back, her movements graceful and fluid. "Tea, please. Earl Grey if you have it." That's when Andrew looked up from his phone, really looked at what was happening at his table. His face darkened like a storm cloud rolling across a clear sky. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice carrying across nearby tables. "Some kind of charity show? We didn't come here for sign language lessons." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my cheeks burn with shame and anger, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of practice hiding my emotions behind a service industry smile. His mother reached out and touched his arm, signing something urgent and disapproving, but he brushed her away. "Just bring the wine and stop with the theatrics," he continued, loud enough that other diners turned to stare. "We're here to eat, not watch you perform." I wanted to disappear. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of rich men who treated waitresses like entertainment. Instead, I nodded and walked away, my legs shaking with humiliation and rage. Behind me, I could hear his mother's voice, the first time she'd spoken aloud that night, saying something sharp and disappointed in the cultured tones of old Manhattan money. The wine service was torture. Every interaction crackled with tension. Andrew ignored me completely, talking loudly about his latest real estate acquisition, a portfolio of luxury condos in Brooklyn that would generate millions in rental income. His mother ate in silence, occasionally glancing at me with apologetic eyes that made my chest ache. When dessert came, she signed discreetly. "Thank you, you're very kind." I signed back, keeping my movements small and careful. "It's my pleasure." Andrew caught the exchange and his jaw tightened. "Enough," he said quietly, but with the kind of authority that came from controlling billion-dollar deals. "We don't need a translator." The damage was done. Word traveled through the restaurant staff like wildfire. "Did you see Belmont humiliate Evelyn? She was just trying to help his mother. Rich bastard thinks he owns the world." But whispers don't protect you when management gets involved. By the end of the night, Richard had pulled me aside. "Mr. Belmont wasn't happy with the service tonight," he said, avoiding my eyes. "He felt you were overly familiar with his mother. Inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "I was trying to help her communicate. That's not your job, Evelyn. Your job is to take orders and bring food, nothing more." I felt something die inside me that night, some small flame of hope that I'd carried for 12 years, the belief that kindness mattered, that treating people with dignity was worth something. Andrew Belmont had snuffed it out with his casual cruelty, his assumption that wealthy men could humiliate working women without consequence. But the story was far from over. In fact, the real story was just beginning. 3 days later, I arrived at work to find Richard waiting by the time clock, his face grim. "My office. Now." I knew before he said the words. You develop an instinct for these things when you've lived paycheck to paycheck for decades. The specific way management looks at you when they're about to take away your livelihood. The false concern in their voice when they destroy your world with corporate doublespeak. "There's been a complaint," Richard began, sliding a folder across his desk, "from Mr. Belmont's party. Apparently, there was an incident with spilled wine that went unreported." My blood turned to ice. "What incident? I didn't spill anything." "According to Mr. Belmont, you knocked over his wine glass during dessert service. The complaint suggests you were distracted by your performance with his mother." The lie was so outrageous, so completely fabricated, that for a moment I couldn't speak. I replayed that entire evening in my head, every step, every interaction. No spilled wine, no accident, nothing but professional service despite his cruelty. "Richard, that never happened. You can check with Maria. She was working the station next to—" "The complaint has been filed," he interrupted. "Corporate has reviewed the situation. I'm sorry, Evelyn, but we have to let you go, effective immediately." The world tilted sideways. 12 years of perfect service record. 12 years of arriving early, staying late, covering shifts for sick coworkers. 12 years of my life dissolved because a millionaire wanted to punish me for showing kindness to his mother. "This is about what happened with his mother, isn't it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's retaliating because I embarrassed him." Richard's face flushed, but he couldn't meet my eyes. "Clean out your locker. Security will escort you out." The walk to my locker felt endless. Other staff members watched from corners, their expressions mixing sympathy with fear. They knew it could be any of them next. Maria squeezed my shoulder as I passed, whispering, "This is wrong," in Spanish. Sandra pressed a folded $20 bill into my hand. Carmen had tears in her eyes. I packed my spare uniform, my comfortable shoes, a photo of my grandchildren I kept taped inside my locker door. 12 years reduced to a small cardboard box and a security guard who looked embarrassed to be escorting a 57-year-old woman to the street. The October air felt sharp against my face as I stood on the sidewalk, holding my pathetic box of belongings. Pedestrians flowed around me like water around a rock, everyone rushing toward their important lives, while mine crumbled in broad daylight. I thought about my rent due in 2 weeks, my car insurance payment, my mother's medication that I helped pay for, the careful budget I'd constructed that required every single tip to survive. Andrew Belmont had destroyed all of it because I dared to be kind to his mother. That night, I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of instant coffee and tried to compute my options. Unemployment would cover part of my expenses, but not enough, not even close. I was too old for most restaurant hiring managers, not skilled enough for office work, too proud to ask my children for money they didn't have to spare. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not just lonely, but desperate, like the quiet before something terrible happens. I called Lisa first, my lawyer daughter in Chicago. Got her voicemail, as usual. "Hi, Mom, can't talk right now. Leave a message." The tone that said she was busy saving the world one billable hour at a time. "Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom. I lost my job today. Don't worry, I'll figure something out. Just wanted you to know. Love you." Michael answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. Kids screaming in the background, television blaring. "Mom, what's wrong? I got fired today." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "Fired? Why? What happened?" I tried to explain about Andrew Belmont, about the sign language, about the false complaint. It sounded crazy even to me. Rich man destroys waitress's life over imagined slight. Who would believe such a thing? "Mom, are you sure you didn't spill the wine? Maybe you just didn't notice." The doubt in his voice broke something inside me. My own son, questioning my memory, my competence. As if 12 years of perfect service meant nothing. As if I was just a confused old woman making up stories. "I need to go," I said quietly. "Mom, wait. Do you need money? I don't have much, but—" "No, I'll figure it out." But I wouldn't figure it out. Not quickly enough anyway. The job market for 57-year-old waitresses in Manhattan is brutal on a good day. When you've been fired for cause, even fabricated cause, it becomes nearly impossible. Day after day, I walked the streets in my best interview outfit, a navy blue dress from Macy's that had seen better decades. Coffee shops, diners, casual restaurants, even fast food places. The responses were always the same. "We'll call you. We're not hiring right now. We need someone with more flexibility." Code words for "you're too old." My savings account, never substantial, dwindled to nothing within 6 weeks. I sold my few pieces of jewelry, including my grandmother's wedding ring. The pawn shop owner gave me $60 for a piece that had been in my family for generations. I sat in his parking lot afterward and cried until my chest hurt. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday, bright pink paper that screamed my failure to everyone in the hallway. Pay or quit. Simple as that. 57 years of life, 12 years of perfect attendance, and I couldn't come up with $850 to keep a roof over my head. That's when the depression really hit. the kind that makes getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking emails, stopped pretending that everything would work out somehow. I ate cereal for dinner and watched old movies until my eyes burned, postponing sleep because my dreams had become indistinguishable from nightmares. But life has a way of throwing you lifelines when you least expect them. Mrs. Chen from the corner bodega knocked on my door one morning, holding a newspaper clipping. She was a tiny woman who'd emigrated from Taiwan 40 years ago and built a successful small business through sheer determination and 16-hour workdays. "Evelyn," she said in her careful English, "there's job posting. Brooklyn Cafe. They need experienced server. Good people, I think." The cafe was called Second Chances, located in Park Slope among the brownstones and young families. It wasn't fancy. Mismatched chairs, locally roasted coffee, a menu written on a chalkboard, but it was clean and warm, and the owner, a woman named Grace in her 40s, actually looked me in the eye when she spoke. "I don't care how old you are," Grace said during my interview. "I care whether you show up on time and treat customers like human beings. Can you do that?" I almost cried right there at her small wooden desk. Yes, absolutely yes. The pay was less than Le Jardin, but the atmosphere was completely different. Grace hired women who needed second chances, former addicts in recovery, single mothers getting back on their feet, older women like me who'd been discarded by a youth-obsessed service industry. We looked out for each other, covered each other's shifts, shared tips when someone's kid was sick. I rented a tiny studio apartment in Sunset Park, close enough to walk to work when the subway was delayed. It was one room with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette. But it was mine. No pink eviction notices, no landlord threatening letters, just a space where I could breathe again. Months passed. The routine of cafe work was familiar but kinder. Regular customers learned my name, asked about my day, left decent tips. I served coffee to writers working on novels, parents juggling toddlers and laptops, elderly couples who'd been coming there for years. It wasn't the money or prestige of Manhattan fine dining, but it fed something in me that had been starving. That's where Andrew Belmont found me. It was a rainy Thursday morning in March, almost 6 months after he'd destroyed my life. I was wiping down tables, humming along to the jazz music Grace played during slow periods. The door chimed, and I looked up to see a figure in an expensive raincoat shaking drops from an umbrella. My blood turned to ice when I recognized him. He looked different somehow, older maybe, more tired. The arrogant confidence I remembered had dimmed to something that almost looked like uncertainty. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the cafe until his eyes found mine. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. The man who'd ruined my life, and the woman who'd survived his cruelty. Then he walked slowly toward my section, his movements careful and deliberate. "Evelyn," he said quietly, Could I sit down?" My hands were shaking, but I gestured to an empty table by the window. He sat heavily, like carrying invisible weight. I approached with my order pad, falling back on professional training because I didn't know what else to do. "What can I get you?" My voice sounded steady, professional. Years of practice hiding my emotions. "Coffee, please, black." He paused, studying his hands. "And I owe you an explanation." Part of me wanted to walk away. Part of me wanted to pour hot coffee in his expensive lap. But a larger part, the part that had endured 12 years of insults and survived 6 months of unemployment, was curious. What could Andrew Belmont possibly say that would matter now? I brought his coffee and sat down across from him, something I never would have done at Le Jardin. But this wasn't Le Jardin, and I wasn't the same woman he'd humiliated that night. "My mother has been asking about you," he began, stirring sugar into his cup with mechanical precision. "Every time we go out to eat, she looks for the waitress who could sign. She was disappointed when she learned what happened." "Disappointed," I repeated flatly. "She was furious, actually. She told me I was a cruel, arrogant man who had forgotten how to treat people with basic human decency. Her exact words. He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. She was right. I said nothing. Let him talk. That night at the restaurant, watching you communicate with her, it reminded me of something I'd been trying to forget. When I was young, maybe 7 or 8, my mother lost most of her hearing in a car accident. The doctors said it would get worse over time, and it has. But back then, I used to translate for her sometimes. Sign language classes, practice sessions, hours of learning to speak with our hands. He stopped, swallowing hard. Then I grew up, got busy making money, building my fortune, acquiring assets like they were trophies. The signing became inconvenient. Embarrassing, maybe. I hired interpreters for important events, found excuses to avoid family dinners where I'd have to slow down and actually communicate with my own mother. My anger was still there, burning steady and strong, but something else was creeping in. Recognition, maybe. The familiar ache of watching someone you love become a stranger. That night, seeing you show her more kindness in 5 minutes than I'd shown her in months, I couldn't handle it. Instead of being grateful, I lashed out. At you, at her, at anyone within reach. He set down his coffee cup with shaking hands, and then I made it worse with that lie about the spilled wine. Why? The word came out harder than I intended. Why destroy my life over your own guilt? Because I'm a coward. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did me. Because it was easier to blame you than face what kind of son I'd become. What kind of man? We sat in silence for a moment. Rain streaked the windows, blurring the street outside into abstract shapes. Other customers chatted quietly at their tables, oblivious to the confrontation playing out in the corner. "The restaurant fired me based on your lie," I said finally. "I lost my apartment, couldn't find work for months, nearly ended up on the street because you were embarrassed about your mother's hearing loss." "I know." His voice was barely audible. "I know, and I'm sorry. More sorry than I have words for. Sorry doesn't pay rent." "No, it doesn't." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This won't undo what I did, but it's a start." I stared at the envelope without touching it. "What is it?" "A check. For the wages you lost, plus interest, and a letter of recommendation that tells the truth about what happened that night." "The truth?" "That you showed extraordinary kindness to a customer who needed help. That you were fired unjustly due to my complaint, which I'm formally retracting. That any restaurant would be lucky to have someone with your professionalism and compassion." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The check made my breath catch. More money than I'd earned in 6 months of unemployment, enough to cover everything I'd lost and more. The letter was typed on official letterhead, signed and notarized, a formal apology that acknowledged his lie and praised my character. "Why now?" I asked. "What changed?" "My mother." He smiled sadly. "She's been visiting Le Jardin every week since you were fired, looking for you. When they told her you weren't coming back, she asked why. Eventually, Richard told her about the complaint. My complaint. What did she do? She called me a liar to my face, said she'd raised me better than that. Then she stopped speaking to me entirely. For 3 months, my own mother wouldn't return my calls, wouldn't answer her door when I visited. The woman who gave me everything, who supported my dreams even when they took me away from her, had written me off because of what I did to you." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling. "I hired a private investigator to find you. Took 2 months to track you down here. Then I spent another month working up the courage to face you." He gestured around the small cafe. "This place suits you better than Le Jardin ever did. You look happier." I was happier, I realized. Despite everything he'd put me through, despite the financial disaster and the months of fear, I was more content serving coffee in Brooklyn than I'd ever been polishing crystal in Manhattan. "The money helps," I said, folding the check carefully. "But it doesn't erase what you did. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to do better, to be better." "Better how?" "I want to help, not just you, but others like you. Workers who get thrown away when they become inconvenient. People who are invisible to men like me." He leaned forward, his eyes earnest, in a way I'd never seen before. "I have resources, connections, capital that could actually make a difference. I just need someone to help me understand how to use them responsibly." It was a pretty speech, but I'd heard wealthy people make pretty speeches before, usually right before they found new ways to exploit the very people they claimed to want to help. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership. You know this industry from the ground up. Understand what workers actually need. I have the financial resources to create something meaningful. Together, we could build something that gives people like you, like us, a real chance at dignity." "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. A restaurant with profit sharing for staff, a training program for older workers, a fund to help service industry people who get fired unjustly." He spread his hands. Vulnerability replacing the arrogance I remembered. "I have money and connections, but I don't have wisdom. I don't have your experience or your understanding of what it means to be discarded." The offer was tempting, but trust doesn't rebuild overnight, especially when it's been shattered by deliberate cruelty. "I need time to think," I said. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table for a $3 cup of coffee. "My card is in the envelope with your contact information. When you're ready to talk, if you're ever ready, call me." He paused at the door, turning back one more time. "For what it's worth, my mother would like to see you again. She says you have kind hands, and she misses talking with someone who understands her world." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with an envelope full of possibilities and a head full of questions. That evening, I called my daughter Lisa. For once, she answered on the first ring. "Mom, I was just thinking about you. How are things at the new job?" I told her everything. About Andrew Belmont, the money, the apology, the strange offer of partnership. She listened without interrupting, something she rarely had time for anymore. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked when I finished. "That he's sincere about wanting to change, but sincerity doesn't guarantee competence, and it doesn't guarantee that 3 months from now he won't get bored and move on to his next charity project." "True, but Mom, you've spent your whole life serving other people's dreams. Maybe it's time to build something of your own." "With his money?" "With anyone's money who's willing to invest in your vision. You know this industry better than anyone. You understand what workers need because you've lived it. That's worth more than all his real estate portfolios and cryptocurrency investments combined." She was right, though it took me another week to admit it. I'd spent 57 years making other people's lives easier, other people's businesses profitable, other people's families possible. What if I could use that knowledge to build something better? I called the number on Andrew's business card on a Tuesday morning before my shift started. "Evelyn," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "Thank you for calling." "I've been thinking about your offer," I said. "If we're going to do this, we do it my way. Workers first, profits second. No exploitation, no shortcuts, no treating people like disposable resources." "Agreed." "I want everything in writing. Legal contracts that protect the staff, not just the investors. Transparent books so everyone knows where the money goes. And I want a real voice in decisions, not just token input that gets ignored when it's inconvenient." "Done. What else?" I took a deep breath. "And I want your mother involved. She knows what it feels like to be ignored, to have her needs dismissed. We could use her perspective." "She would love that. She's been following your story since Le Jardin fired you. I think she considers you a friend." "Friends don't get friends fired for doing their jobs." "No," he said quietly. "They don't. That was all me, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it." We met the following Saturday at a quiet restaurant in Greenwich Village. His suggestion, my choice of location. Somewhere neutral, somewhere I felt comfortable. His mother was already there when I arrived, her face lighting up when she saw me across the room. She stood as I approached, her movements careful but eager. Without hesitation, she signed, "I'm so sorry for what happened. My son was wrong." I signed back, "Thank you for saying that. It means everything." Andrew watched our conversation with something that looked like wonder, like he'd forgotten how beautiful sign language could be. When we finally sat down to business, his mother participated fully, switching between spoken English and sign language as her energy dictated. The partnership we outlined that afternoon was unlike anything I'd imagined when I first picked up a coffee pot 12 years ago. We would start small, a single cafe in Brooklyn with profit sharing for all employees, living wages, comprehensive benefits, paid sick leave, and a policy that no one could be fired without documented cause and a formal review process. But the real innovation was the training program. We would hire women over 50, people with disabilities, workers who'd been written off by other employers. We'd provide job training, financial literacy classes, and most importantly, the kind of respect and dignity that had been missing from my years in fine dining. Andrew's connections in the real estate world helped us find the perfect location, a former bakery in Prospect Heights with good foot traffic and reasonable rent. His investment capital covered the renovation, equipment, and operating expenses for the first year, but the vision, the values, the daily operations would be mine to design and manage. We called it Second Helping, a name that reflected both the food service and the second chances we offered to everyone who walked through our doors, staff and customers alike. The renovation took 3 months. Every day after my shift at Grace's Cafe, I'd walk over to watch the progress. Painters covering old walls with warm, welcoming colors. Electricians installing lighting that would be bright enough for older eyes. Carpenters building a counter at the perfect height for someone in a wheelchair. Andrew showed up most days too, sometimes in work clothes instead of his usual suits. He painted walls, assembled furniture, learned to operate the espresso machine. His mother came by twice a week with homemade cookies for the construction crew, communicating with the workers through a mixture of sign language, broken Spanish, and the universal language of kindness. I hired carefully. Rosa, a 62-year-old former restaurant manager who'd been laid off when her company decided she was overqualified for their new direction. James, a veteran in his 50s, whose PTSD had made it difficult to hold steady employment. Patricia, recently divorced and re-entering the workforce after 20 years of raising children. Each person brought skills and experience that had been dismissed elsewhere, but were treasures in our small operation. We opened on a rainy Thursday in October, exactly 1 year after I'd been fired from Le Jardin. I stood behind the counter at 6 a.m. wearing an apron I'd chosen myself, forest green with our logo embroidered in gold, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: pride. The first customer was Mrs. Chen from the bodega, beaming as she ordered a cappuccino and a blueberry muffin. The second was Grace from Second Chances, bringing her entire morning staff to celebrate. By noon, we had a line out the door, neighbors curious about the new place, former customers from my Le Jardin days who'd tracked me down, and friends who'd spread word through Brooklyn's small business network. Andrew's mother sat at her favorite table by the window, holding court with a group of elderly women from her apartment building. She'd learned to order in sign language. And watching other customers pick up basic signs to communicate with her had become one of the cafe's small daily miracles. But the real magic happened behind the scenes. Rosa developed a mentorship program for new hires, teaching young workers the skills they'd need to advance in the restaurant industry. James created a community board where customers could post job openings, apartment listings, and requests for help. Patricia organized monthly dignity dinners, where service workers from around the neighborhood could eat for free and share their stories without judgment. 6 months after opening, a food critic from the Brooklyn paper wrote a review that brought tears to my eyes. Second Helping serves more than excellent coffee and homemade pastries. They serve hope to workers who've been discarded by an industry that values youth and desperation over experience and dignity. The staff here aren't just employees. They're partners in something revolutionary, a business that proves treating people decently is not only possible, it's profitable. We were profitable, not wealthy, not generating the millions that Andrew's real estate ventures produced, but sustainable and growing. More importantly, we were changing lives. Rosa was taking night classes in business management, planning to open her own restaurant someday. James had saved enough money to bring his daughter from California for Christmas. Patricia's confidence had blossomed so much that she'd started dating again, something she thought she'd never have the courage to do. And me? I was learning what it meant to be valued for my mind as well as my hands. Andrew consulted me on every business decision, from menu changes to staff scheduling. When the New York Times called for an interview about our model, he insisted that I be the primary spokesperson. When a group of investors offered to franchise our concept across the city, he refused to make any commitments without my approval. The relationship between us had evolved from adversary to something like friendship, though trust remained a fragile thing that required constant tending. He'd proven his commitment through consistent actions over months, but I never forgot how quickly he'd been willing to destroy my life when it suited his purposes. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal cleanly. His mother, however, had become a genuine friend. She visited the cafe 3 times a week, not just as a customer, but as an unofficial ambassador for our mission. She'd learned the names of every regular, remembered their orders and their stories, and had a gift for making newcomers feel welcome. Watching her bloom in an environment where her communication needs were accommodated rather than ignored was proof that accessibility benefits everyone. 1 year after our opening, we hosted an anniversary party that filled the entire cafe and spilled onto the sidewalk. Customers, staff, neighbors, and supporters mingled over champagne and a cake decorated with sign language symbols for celebration. Andrew gave a speech thanking everyone who'd supported us, but when he tried to credit me as the visionary behind Second Helping, I stepped forward to correct him. "This isn't one person's vision," I said, looking around at faces that had become family over the past months. "This is what happens when people who've been invisible finally get seen, when workers who've been discarded get the chance to show their value, when someone's mistake becomes everyone's opportunity to do better." I caught Andrew's eye as I spoke, and he nodded with understanding. His mistake, firing me based on a lie, treating me as disposable, had led to something neither of us could have imagined alone. The partnership that grew from his guilt and my desperation had created something larger than either of our individual stories. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the party cleanup. As staff and volunteers worked together washing dishes and stacking chairs, Andrew's mother pulled me aside. "Thank you," she signed, "for teaching my son how to see people again." "He did the work," I signed back. "I just showed him there was work to be done." "No," she continued, her hands shaping careful, deliberate words. "You showed him that kindness isn't weakness, that dignity isn't expensive, that treating people well isn't charity, it's justice." She was right, though it had taken me 57 years to learn those lessons myself. For too long, I'd accepted cruelty as the price of survival, dismissal as the natural order of things. I'd believed that being invisible was safer than demanding to be seen, that enduring mistreatment was noble rather than tragic. Andrew's cruelty had forced me to confront those beliefs and choose differently, not just for myself, but for everyone who walked through our doors carrying the weight of being underestimated, undervalued, or simply unseen. As I write this story, Second Helping is preparing to open its second location, this time in Queens near my old neighborhood. We've developed a training manual for other cafes who want to implement similar worker-centered policies, and Andrew is funding a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting service industry workers who face discrimination or unjust termination. The work is far from finished. Every day, women like I used to be clock in at restaurants where they're treated as invisible, disposable, or worse. Every day, wealthy customers like Andrew used to be dismiss the humanity of people who serve them. Every day, the economic systems that create such vast gaps between server and served continue to operate as if some people matter more than others. But every day, we also prove that different choices are possible. Every respectful interaction, every living wage paid, every worker promoted based on merit rather than age or appearance creates ripples that spread beyond our small cafe in Brooklyn. I think about the woman I was 2 years ago, exhausted, invisible, convinced that endurance was my only option. She couldn't have imagined standing here now, owning a successful business, mentoring other workers, speaking at conferences about dignity in the workplace. She'd spent so long defining herself by what she could do for others that she'd forgotten to imagine what she might do for herself. The journey from that broken woman to this empowered one wasn't simple or quick. It required confronting the people who'd hurt me, accepting help from unexpected sources, and learning to value my own worth as much as I'd always valued serving others. It meant risking failure, disappointment, and the possibility that kindness wouldn't be enough to build something sustainable. But kindness, it turns out, was exactly enough. Combined with experience, determination, and the resources of a partner who'd learned to see beyond his own privilege, kindness became the foundation for something revolutionary. A business that treats workers as human beings rather than cost centers. The morning I finally resigned from Grace's Cafe to work at Second Helping full-time, she hugged me with tears in her eyes. "You're going to show the whole industry how it should be done," she said. "Every woman over 50 deserves what you've built. Not charity, but opportunity. Not pity, but respect." She was right. Every woman over 50 who's ever carried a tray, wiped a table, or smiled through customers' casual cruelty deserves better than survival. We deserve the chance to build, to lead, to be valued for our wisdom as much as our service. That's the lesson Andrew learned, though it cost us both dearly for him to learn it. That's the lesson his mother has been teaching through her grace and resilience. And that's the lesson I hope to share with anyone who's ever felt invisible in their own life story. You are not disposable. Your experience has value. Your kindness is a strength, not a weakness, and it's never too late to rewrite the ending of your story. Standing in our cafe this morning, watching Rosa train a new hire with patient expertise, seeing James chat with regular customers who've become friends, observing Patricia confidently handle a delivery from our suppliers, I felt something I'd never expected to feel at 59 years old. Possibility. The future stretches ahead, not as something to endure, but as something to shape. Second Helping is just the beginning of what becomes possible when invisible people demand to be seen, when discarded workers claim their value, when someone's worst mistake becomes someone else's greatest opportunity. Andrew still comes in every morning for coffee, still asks for my input on his other business ventures, still treats our partnership with the respect I should have received from the beginning. His mother holds her weekly sign language classes at our corner table, teaching customers and staff alike that communication comes in many forms, all of them worthy of attention and respect. But the real victory isn't in their transformation, it's in mine. It's in the recognition that surviving isn't the same as living, that serving others beautifully doesn't require sacrificing yourself, and that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift you can receive. Because when people don't see you coming, when they write you off as just another middle-aged waitress with tired feet and faded dreams, you have the power to surprise them. You have the opportunity to build something so unexpectedly beautiful, so fundamentally different from their assumptions, that you change not just your own story, but everyone else's understanding of what's possible. That power has been inside all of us all along. We just needed the right circumstances to remember how to use it. But the story didn't end with the first anniversary party. If anything, that celebration marked the beginning of something even larger than I dared to imagine. 2 weeks after the party, while I was reviewing inventory reports in my small office above the cafe, Andrew knocked on my door with an expression I'd learned to recognize over the past year. It was the look he got when an idea had taken hold of him so completely that sleep became optional until he could share it with someone else. "I've been thinking about what you said at the party," he began, settling into the mismatched chair I'd rescued from a thrift store, "about people being invisible until they demand to be seen." "And?" I set down my papers, giving him my full attention. Andrew's ideas had evolved considerably since our first partnership discussion, where he once spoke only in terms of profit margins and market positioning. He now talked about human dignity and systemic change. What if we could make the invisible visible on a much larger scale, not just in our cafe, but across the entire industry? I waited for him to continue, having learned that his best ideas usually required a few minutes to unfold properly. "A documentary," he said finally, "about workers like you, like Rosa, like James, people whose stories have been deemed unworthy of attention because they don't fit the narrative that success is only for the young, the connected, the privileged." The idea intrigued me, but I'd grown cautious about projects that promised to give voice to the voiceless. Too often, such efforts became more about the people telling the stories than the people living them. "Who would control the narrative?" I asked. "You would. We would hire a production company, yes, but the editorial decisions would be yours. The stories would be told the way you and the other workers want them told, not filtered through someone else's interpretation of what makes good television." I considered this carefully. In the months since Second Helping had opened, I'd received dozens of interview requests from food bloggers, business magazines, even a morning show producer who wanted to do a segment about inspiring comeback stories. I'd turned them all down because they all seemed more interested in the feel-good angle than the systemic issues that made such comebacks necessary in the first place. "What would be different about this?" I asked. Andrew leaned forward, his eyes bright with the intensity I remembered from our early planning sessions. "We wouldn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths. We talk about ageism in hiring, about the way wealth insulates people from understanding the consequences of their actions, about how kindness is treated as weakness in industries that prioritize efficiency over humanity. And you'd be willing to be filmed talking about your part in all this? The lie that got me fired? The 3 months you let your mother think you were someone she couldn't respect?" He swallowed hard but nodded. "If it helps people understand how quickly privilege can turn into cruelty, yes. If it shows other people in positions of power what that cruelty actually costs, then yes, I'll talk about all of it." This was the Andrew I'd learned to trust over the past year, not the confident executive who never doubted his own judgment, but the uncertain man who'd learned to question everything he thought he knew about merit, worth, and the people who serve others for a living. "I'll think about it," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I knew I was already leaning toward yes. The documentary could reach people our cafe never would, could plant seeds in minds that had never seriously considered what it meant to work in service industries past the age of 35. That evening, I called a staff meeting to discuss the proposal. Rosa, James, Patricia, and our newest hire, Margaret, a former bank executive who'd been laid off at 58 and couldn't find work anywhere else, gathered around the small table in our back room. "Before you decide," Rosa said when I finished explaining the documentary idea, "you need to understand what you're risking. Once our faces are on film, we can't take them back. If this thing gets twisted into something that makes us look pitiful or naive, we could lose everything we've built," James finished. "Not just the cafe, but the respect we've earned. People could start seeing us as charity cases instead of skilled workers." These were valid concerns. The service industry was small and interconnected. A documentary that portrayed us as symbols rather than individuals could make it difficult for any of us to find work elsewhere if second helping ever failed. But Margaret, who'd been quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. "I spent 30 years in banking," she said, her voice steady and thoughtful. "I watched dozens of older women get pushed out when the company decided they wanted a younger demographic. Most of them disappeared quietly, grateful for whatever severance they could negotiate. They stayed invisible because it seemed safer." She paused, looking around the table at each of us. "But invisible doesn't protect you. It just makes it easier for them to pretend the problem doesn't exist. Maybe it's time to stop being easy to ignore." The vote was unanimous. The next 6 months became a whirlwind of filming, interviews, and moments of profound vulnerability. The documentary crew, a team of young filmmakers who specialized in social justice stories, spent weeks getting to know us not as subjects, but as collaborators. They filmed during rush hours and slow afternoons, captured conversations between customers and staff, documented the weekly sign language classes that had become a neighborhood institution. But the most difficult sessions were the individual interviews, where each of us sat alone with the camera and told our stories without the buffer of customer service smiles or professional courtesy. Rosa spoke about sending money to children in El Salvador she hadn't seen in 6 years, about cleaning office buildings at night while studying for her GED. James talked about coming home from Iraq to a country that thanked him for his service, but wouldn't hire him because his hands shook sometimes when he was stressed. Patricia's interview was particularly powerful. She described the first time she'd tried to re-enter the workforce after her divorce, how the 20-something manager at a chain restaurant had looked her up and down and said, "We're really looking for someone with more energy." The way she'd driven home in tears, convinced that at 45, her life was essentially over. "But working here showed me that experience doesn't mean expired," she said to the camera. "It means I know things. I know how to talk to an angry customer without taking it personally. I know how to spot someone who's having the worst day of their life and needs an extra moment of kindness. That's worth something." My own interview took 3 sessions to complete. The first time, I couldn't get through the story of being fired without crying, not from sadness, but from rage that still burned bright after all this time. The second session was better, but I kept stopping to explain context, to make sure the viewers would understand that Andrew's transformation was real, that this wasn't a simple story of a villain becoming a hero. The third session was when I finally found the words I'd been searching for. "People think kindness is free," I said, looking directly into the camera. "But it's not. Kindness costs us our invisibility. When I signed to Andrew's mother that night at Le Jardin, I stopped being invisible. I became a person with skills and compassion and the willingness to use them, even when it wasn't required of me. That made me dangerous to someone who needed me to stay in my place." I paused, remembering that night, the moment when everything changed. The question isn't why I showed kindness to a customer who needed it. The question is why that kindness was so threatening that it had to be punished. What kind of system requires us to ignore each other's humanity in order to function? Andrew's interview was the most difficult to watch. He sat in the same spot where I'd just finished my own session, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of the camera or the questions, but of having to confront the person he'd been just 2 years earlier. "I want to be clear about something," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "I didn't have some kind of sudden moral awakening. I didn't see Evelyn signing with my mother and immediately realize the error of my ways. I saw it and felt threatened by it. I felt exposed by the contrast between her kindness and my neglect." The interviewer, a young woman named Carmen who reminded me of my former co-worker with the same name, pressed him gently but firmly. "Can you talk about the decision to file a false complaint?" Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly. carefully chosen. There's this thing that happens when you have enough money to insulate yourself from consequences. You start to believe that your version of events is the only one that matters. If I said Evelyn spilled wine, then she must have spilled wine. Because why would I lie? It becomes easier to reshape reality than to admit you were wrong. But you did admit you were wrong, eventually. Because my mother taught me that some relationships matter more than being right. When she stopped speaking to me, I had to choose between my version of events and having a relationship with the woman who raised me. It took me 3 months to make that choice. 3 months, he repeated, shame evident in his voice. The interview continued for over an hour, with Andrew detailing not just his treatment of me, but the broader patterns in his business dealings, the way wealth had allowed him to dismiss the concerns and experiences of people who couldn't fight back. It was painful to watch, but also necessary. His honesty about the corrupting influence of unchecked privilege gave the documentary a depth that simple redemption narratives usually lack. But perhaps the most moving interview came from someone I hadn't expected to participate, Andrew's mother. She'd initially declined to be filmed, insisting that the focus should remain on the workers whose stories deserved attention. But as production continued and she saw how thoughtfully the film was being constructed, she changed her mind. She spoke to the camera in a mixture of spoken English and sign language, which was translated through subtitles. Her hearing had deteriorated further in the past year, but her thinking remained sharp and her observations incisive. "People think being deaf makes you invisible," she signed, her movements graceful despite her arthritis. "But actually, it makes you see things others miss. You learn to read faces, body language, the space between what people say and what they mean." She paused, gathering her thoughts. That night at the restaurant, I could see that my son was embarrassed by me, by my hearing aids, by the way I had to lean forward to understand the server, by the fact that his mother wasn't the perfect accessory he wanted for his business dinner. But then this waitress, Evelyn, looked at me and saw someone worth communicating with, not a problem to be managed, but a person deserving of respect. The contrast between her dignity and her son's former cruelty was stark and painfully beautiful. Evelyn lost her job for treating me like a human being, she continued. That tells you something important about a world that punishes kindness and rewards cruelty. But it also tells you something about the power of choosing to do right, even when it costs you everything. The documentary, which we titled Second Helping: Stories of Dignity and Work, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival 18 months after filming began. I sat in the theater between Andrew and his mother, watching our lives play out on a screen larger than my entire studio apartment had been. The audience was mostly film industry people and critics, not exactly the working-class viewers we hoped to reach eventually. But their response was immediate and visceral. People laughed at James's dry humor, gasped at Andrew's admission of lying about the spilled wine, and several times I heard sniffling in the darkness when Rosa talked about her children. The Q&A session afterward was more intense than I'd expected. A restaurant owner from New Jersey stood up to challenge our model, arguing that profit sharing and higher wages would make small businesses unsustainable. I responded by sharing our financial records, something we'd discussed in advance, showing that our workers' higher wages had actually reduced turnover costs and increased productivity. A young filmmaker asked Andrew why he'd agreed to expose his own failures so publicly. His answer was simple: because the story isn't complete without acknowledging how power operates. If we only tell inspiring stories about workers overcoming adversity, we let the people creating that adversity off the hook. But the question that brought me to tears came from an older woman in the back of the theater. She identified herself as a former hotel housekeeper, laid off at 60 and unable to find work since. "Watching your film," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I felt seen for the first time in 3 years. But I want to know, what do I do with that feeling when I leave this theater? How do I carry this dignity you talk about into a world that still refuses to hire me?" The question was devastating in its honesty, and I felt the weight of responsibility that came with telling stories about overcoming injustice. It wasn't enough to document the problem or even to model solutions. We had to provide practical paths forward for people who were still trapped in systems that treated them as disposable. "Come work with us," I said simply, not just at Second Helping, but on the organization we're building. We need people with your experience to help create more places where dignity isn't a luxury, it's a baseline expectation. That's how the Second Helping Foundation was born. What started as a single cafe had evolved into something much larger, a network of businesses committed to worker-centered policies, a training program for older workers, and an advocacy organization pushing for policy changes at the local and state level. The documentary's success opened doors I'd never imagined walking through. I testified before the New York City Council about age discrimination in hiring. I spoke at business schools about sustainable employment practices. I was invited to conferences where executives who'd never thought seriously about their treatment of service workers suddenly found themselves questioning practices they'd taken for granted. But the most meaningful response came in the form of letters and emails from workers across the country who'd seen the film and wanted to share their own stories. Teachers forced into retirement by school districts that wanted fresh blood. Nurses laid off because their experience made them too expensive. Retail workers whose decades of customer service expertise were deemed irrelevant by managers half their age. Each story reinforced what I'd learned through my own experience. The problem wasn't individual bad actors, but systemic devaluation of experience, wisdom, and the kind of deep competence that only comes with time. 6 months after the documentary's release, we opened our third location, not another cafe, but a training center in partnership with the local community college. Older workers could take classes in everything from basic computer skills to small business management, but the real innovation was the mentorship component. Experienced workers taught younger ones the soft skills that no textbook could convey: how to read a room, how to diffuse tension, how to provide service that felt personal rather than transactional. Andrew's mother became the program's unofficial ambassador, teaching sign language classes and serving as living proof that communication barriers could become bridges when approached with patience and creativity. Her hearing continued to deteriorate, but her involvement in the program gave her a sense of purpose that energized everyone around her. On her 75th birthday, we threw a party at the original Second Helping location. The cafe was packed with workers from all our programs, regular customers who'd become friends, and supporters who'd helped turn a single successful business into a small movement for change. She stood at the front of the cafe, her hands moving in the sign language that had brought us all together in the first place, thanking everyone for creating a community where being different wasn't a disadvantage, but a strength. Andrew translated for those who didn't sign, his own movement still clunky but heartfelt. "She says," he interpreted, "that she's proud to be part of something that proves kindness isn't weakness, it's revolution." The crowd erupted in applause, but she wasn't finished. She reached for the microphone, preparing to speak aloud, something she did rarely now, as her hearing loss made it difficult to modulate her voice. "2 years ago," she said, the words carefully pronounced, "I was just a customer who needed patience. Tonight, I'm surrounded by family I chose and who chose me back. That's what happens when we stop being invisible to each other." As the party continued around us, I found myself standing with Andrew near the community board that James had created, now expanded to 3 large bulletin boards covered with job postings, apartment listings, offers of help, and expressions of gratitude. The original vision of a cafe where service workers felt valued had grown into something approaching a genuine community. "Do you ever regret it?" Andrew asked quietly. "The way this all started, I mean. If I hadn't lied about the spilled wine, you might still be working at Le Jardin, living a simpler life." I considered the question seriously. The woman I'd been 2 years earlier had wanted security above all else. a steady paycheck, health insurance, enough money to pay rent and help my family when needed. She would have found the risks we'd taken, the public attention, the responsibility for so many other people's livelihoods, overwhelming. That woman needed simplicity, I said finally, but she also needed to matter. She needed to know that her experience and kindness had value beyond what tips she could earn and how many tables she could serve. Your lie forced her to discover that. It almost destroyed her first, but then it saved her. Still seems like a cruel way to find salvation. Maybe, but cruelty followed by justice feels different than cruelty followed by nothing. At least our story had the chance to mean something. As if summoned by our conversation, Rosa approached with a young woman I didn't recognize. She introduced her as her daughter, Carmen, the same name as our former Le Jardin co-worker and the documentary filmmaker. Carmen had just graduated from nursing school and was moving to New York to start her residency at Bellevue Hospital. "Mommy has been telling me about this place since you opened," Carmen said, her English carrying the musical accent of her mother's homeland. "She says it's where women like us get to matter." I looked around the cafe, at Patricia training a new hire with patient attention, at James discussing apartment hunting with a customer who'd become a friend, at the wall of thank you notes from workers who'd found jobs through our network, at the sign language class meeting in the corner where people of all ages practice communicating without words. "Your mother is right," I said. "This is where everyone gets to matter." But even as I spoke those words, I knew our work was far from finished. The documentary had raised awareness. The foundation was creating opportunities, and individual lives were being changed every day. Yet the larger systems that created the need for places like Second Helping remained intact. Every week brought new stories of experienced workers facing age discrimination, of service industry employees treated as disposable, of people whose humanity was invisible to those they served. For every person we helped, dozens more remained trapped in situations where dignity was a luxury they couldn't afford. The scope of the problem could feel overwhelming, but I'd learned something important in my years of carrying trays and wiping tables. You don't change everything at once. You change one interaction at a time, one policy at a time, one story at a time. Revolution happens not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small acts of respect, kindness, and recognition that every person's experience has value. Standing in our cafe that night, surrounded by people whose lives had intersected through service and struggle and the radical decision to see each other fully, I felt something I'd never expected when I first put on a server's apron 30 years ago. Hope that stretched beyond my own survival. The future would bring new challenges, economic downturns that tested our sustainability, policy battles that required sustained advocacy, and the ongoing work of changing hearts and minds, one conversation at a time. But it would also bring new opportunities to prove that businesses could prioritize both profitability and humanity, that experience was an asset rather than a liability, and that the true measure of a society lay in how it treated the people who kept its daily operations running smoothly. Andrew was right that our story began with cruelty. But it was proving that cruelty doesn't have to be the final word. Sometimes it's just the painful beginning of something better, if we have the courage to write a different ending. As the evening wound down and the last guests gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, I stayed behind to help clean up. Old habits die hard, and there was something satisfying about wiping down tables one more time, making sure the space was ready for tomorrow's customers. Andrew's mother was the last to leave, moving slowly but refusing help as she made her way to the door. She paused on the threshold and turned back to sign one final message. "Thank you for teaching all of us how to serve with dignity." I signed back, "Thank you for teaching us all how to be served with grace." She smiled, and for a moment I saw not the elderly woman with failing hearing, but the young mother who had raised a son with enough love to make his eventual redemption possible. Even in his cruelest moment, that foundation of love she'd provided had remained, waiting to be rediscovered when the price of ignoring it became too high to bear. As her taxi pulled away, I locked the door of Second Helping and turned off the lights, leaving only the small lamp that illuminated our mission statement engraved on a wooden plaque by the register. Everyone who enters here matters. Everyone who works here thrives. Everyone who leaves here carries a piece of dignity with them into the world. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that a different way of doing business was not just possible, but profitable. Tomorrow, Rosa would teach another new hire that experience was an asset. James would help another customer find housing. Patricia would show another divorced woman re-entering the workforce that it was never too late to rebuild. And I would continue learning what it meant to matter, not just for what I could produce or how efficiently I could serve, but for who I was. A woman whose kindness had been tested and refined by difficulty, whose wisdom had been earned through years of both service and struggle, whose story had become part of something larger than any individual life. The subway ride home felt different than those early morning commutes from Queens to Manhattan. Instead of dreading the day ahead, I found myself planning it. Instead of hiding behind invisibility, I was learning to take up space. Instead of survival, I was building something sustainable, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt discarded by a world that confused youth with energy and experience with obsolescence. The documentary had ended with a title card that read, "The Second Helping Foundation has helped over 500 experienced workers find employment and supported 50 businesses in implementing dignity-centered policies." But those numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the real victory, the gradual shift in consciousness that happened when invisible people demanded to be seen, when discarded workers claimed their value, when someone's worst mistake became everyone's opportunity to choose differently. That night, as I prepared for sleep in my modest apartment, larger now than the studio in Sunset Park, but still simple, still mine, I thought about all the women who would clock in tomorrow morning at restaurants where they were treated as invisible, all the customers who would dismiss their servers without a thought, all the managers who would prioritize efficiency over humanity because they'd never been taught to consider another way. The work of changing those dynamics would continue long after my own working days were over. But now there was proof that change was possible, that businesses could treat workers with dignity and still thrive, that age and experience could be assets rather than liabilities when given the chance to prove their worth. I had become more than I'd ever imagined when I first learned to balance plates and smile through criticism. I had become part of a story that was still being written, a movement that was still growing, a proof of concept that kindness and justice were not naive ideals, but practical foundations for sustainable business and meaningful life. The city that never sleeps continued its restless energy outside my window, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success, dignity, and connection. Somewhere among them were workers like I used to be, invisible, exhausted, convinced that survival was the best they could hope for. Tomorrow, some of them would walk into Second Helping looking for coffee and find community instead. Others would hear about our training programs and discover that their experience had value in a job market that had written them off. Still others would watch our documentary and recognize their own stories reflected back with dignity and respect. Each of those encounters would plant seeds that might not bloom for months or years, but would eventually grow into new businesses, new policies, new ways of treating people whose labor made everyone else's comfort possible. The revolution I'd never expected to be part of would continue one conversation, one hire, one moment of recognition at a time. And in the morning, I would wake up not to an alarm clock demanding that I rush to serve others, but to sunlight streaming through windows of a life I had built, a community I had helped create, and possibilities I had learned to imagine. The woman who had been invisible for so long had finally learned not just how to be seen, but how to help others step into the light as well. The story that began with a lie and a firing had become something beautiful and enduring, proof that even our most painful experiences could become the foundation for something better if we had the courage to build on them rather than simply endure them. That's the gift I want to leave with anyone who has ever felt discarded, invisible, or convinced that their best days were behind them. Your experience has value. Your kindness has power. Your story matters. And it's never too late to write a different ending, not just for yourself, but for everyone whose path intersects with yours. So tell me, have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you served others while your own dreams grew cold? Have you endured dismissal, disrespect, or discrimination because of your age, your gender, or your station in life? Share your story in the comments below because every story matters and every voice deserves to be heard. If this journey touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so we can reach other women who need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your power, your dignity, and your dreams. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for walking this path of transformation with me. I'll see you in the next story where we'll continue exploring what it means to be truly seen, truly valued, and truly alive.